Okay, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and welcome to chapter 18 of Shmuel Aleph, and a welcome to everyone around the world as we continue our story through Tanakh, as we go through it. And we're now reaching the chapters which deal with Shaul's jealousy of David, and what's hinted at in the Midrashim beginning last week and the week before in chapter 17 and 16 is front and center in chapter 18. As David's fame spreads throughout the country and the people, Shaul becomes more and more jealous. And we're going to see that. That's basically a nutshell of what's going to happen in chapter 18. And we're going to see how Shaul becomes jealous because his family, his daughter, his son, his inner circle, they all become very close with David. So let's begin here. It says, Pasuk Aleph, Vahi kechalato ledaber el Shaul, v'nefesh Yehonatan nikshara b'nefesh David, vaye'ahavehu v'Yehonatan kenafsho. And it was, as David finished speaking to Shaul, that Yonatan's soul, his nefesh, had become attached to David's nefesh, and Yonatan loved him as himself. And this is an interesting description here of Yonatan's love for David. And what is it that attracted Yonatan to David? We go to the commentaries, and the Malbim writes, what was it that attracted Yonatan to David? What was their special bond? Is the fact that they were similar in nature. Just as David had stood up to Goliath, so too Yonatan and his armor bearer went out against the Philistine garrison, as we saw a few chapters ago. Both had such strong trust in Hashem's protective loving kindness that they were not cowed by their enemies, despite the great odds opposing them. And so here, what is it that we're saying? That Yonatan was attracted to what he was like. He saw that there was no pretense behind David. There was no ego. It was, Hashem is with me, and therefore I have nothing to fear. I can achieve anything. My emunah in Hashem, my bitachon in Hashem, my trust in him will get me through anything. And therefore, that's what attracted him. He saw another person just like himself, which was very appealing. We continue, and we see here in Pasuk Bet, Vayikachehu Shaul bayom hahu, velo netano lashuv beit aviv. And Shaul took him on that day and did not allow him to return to his father's house. Now, this is another interesting pasuk, something which the Navi Shmuel warned the people, that once you have a king, the king can take your children, press them into service, and there's nothing you can do. But what else is there behind this? The Al-Shikh, who I've told you before, another great Turkish Sephardic rabbi who moved to Eretz Yisrael in the 18th century, he writes that Shaul was already fearful and suspicious of David, that he would take his throne, so Shaul would not allow him to return home, perhaps concerned that David would consult with his family members, with his father, with his brothers, with his kinsmen, because David was from the tribe of Yehudah, that he was concerned about that. Malbim sees it completely differently. At the beginning, Shaul also loved David, as he wanted him to stay in the royal court and to marry his daughter. What are we saying here? That at the beginning, there wasn't jealousy. As I said, the Midrashim, which play on it, which is, at what point did Shaul become jealous of David? Is it where we see it in the text, as we're going to see in the coming Pesukim? Or is it earlier? Are there seeds of distrust which Shaul has early on? And the Al-Shikh is saying it's early. It's all the way back in chapter 17. It's even in chapter 16. Whereas the Malbim is saying, no, quite the opposite. Why does he want to keep him in the palace? Not like a prisoner, but the opposite. He wants his beloved future son-in-law. He wants his, the person who killed Goliath, he's a hero. Let's have him in the palace to show him off. There's no reason to hide from him at all. Or as Esther says, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Absolutely. Definitely, very much. So here we go. So let's continue in the psukim. Gimel, Vayichro Yonatan v'David brit be'ahavato oto kenafsho. And Yonatan made a covenant, a brit with David, because he loved him as himself, or like his own soul. Vayitpashet Yonatan et hameil asher alav vayitenehu leDavid umadav v'ad charbo v'ad kashto v'ad chagoro. And Yonatan took off his cloak, which was on him, and gave it to David, and his garments, even his own sword, and even his bow, and even his girdle. And this is an interesting point of Yonatan taking off his clothes. These are the clothes of royalty. These are the signs that, guess what? Yonatan is saying, I am destined, or I should be, the next king of Israel. But I know that you are better than I, that you are the spiritual heir to my father's throne. That's the way that some of the commentaries take that verse. Okay, that this is a spiritual handing over of the baton, which is, you know what? I'll follow you into battle. I'll be at your right-hand side. But we are not adversaries, you know? You are the leader, David, and I am your second. That's what Yonatan is saying. Hey, vayetze David b'chol asher ishlachenu Shaul yaskil vaysimehu Shaul al anshe hamilchama vayitav be'enei kol ha'am v'gam be'enei avdei Shaul. And David went out wherever Shaul would send him, he would succeed. Accordingly, Shaul appointed him over the soldiers, and he was pleasing in the eyes of all the people, and also in the eyes of Shaul's servants. And this is it. This is the rise and rise and rise of David. And at this point, everyone's happy. Even Shaul's servants. You would expect there to be some sort of animosity, some jealousy that David is taking on these high roles of office, to be the chief of the army or very high up in the army. Wasn't there going to be any jealousy there? Would Avner not be jealous? What about, why is no one, everyone hear me okay? I think my internet is a little wavy in and out there. There doesn't seem to be any jealousy right now as you read the text. And then we have this pasuk. Here's where it starts to go a little haywire. Vahi, in pasuk vav, Vahi bevoam b'shuv David mehakot et ha'pelishti, v'tetzena hanashim mikol arei Yisrael lashir, v'mecholot likrat Shaul hamelech betupim besimcha uvshalishim. It was when they came, when David returned from slaying the Pelishti, the Goliath, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel to sing, and with musical instruments toward King Shaul, with drums, with joy, and with cymbals. Vata'anena hanashim hamesachakot vatomarna hikash Shaul be'alafav, the David berivavotav. And the cheering women sang out and said, Shaul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. And what does that mean? What does it mean here that on the face of it, who did they come out to greet? It says they came out to greet the king. and also they want to acknowledge David. Now I can read that pasuk, one of two ways. I can see the pasuk straight away. Shaul is successful, but David's even more successful. But I could also say that that it's also a positive on Shaul. Rob notes a very interesting point there, that when it came to Shirat Hayam, the women were singing praises of God. Here, look at Yeridat Hadorot, the diminishing of the generations, that now, instead of acknowledging God, they're acknowledging human beings. And perhaps that's the issue. And again, it's more musar, it's more rebuke to us that we need kings and we need leaders, rather than, why do we need these intermediaries in the first place? We should be able to acknowledge God. And that's what David wanted. David said, who is the victory for? The victory is for Hashem. Hashem is doing all of this, but instead they're acknowledging, who is it? Is it Shaul or is it David? And because there's this new jealousy, now we're going to see what happens. Chet, vayicha leShaul me'od. And Shaul was very angry, or as the English says here, chagrined. Vayira be'enav, and it was very evil in his eyes, or it displeased him, hadavar hazeh. Vayomer natnu leDavid revavot, veli natnu ha'alafim, v'od lo ach ha'melucha. They ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they only ascribe thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? Vahi Shaul oyen et David mehayom hahu v'hala. And Shaul eyed David from that day on. You see that word oyen from the word ayin. Could be he looked at him ayin hara, he looked at him negatively. He ascribed to him negativity, or he mistrusted him. He looked at him negatively. Here, the Ma'am Loez notes, from here we to see to what degree jealousy can corrupt justice. Shaul did not mind that David had been credited with the tens of thousands, as he recognized that David had sanctified God's name. He was upset that they did not call him King Saul. It should have been Shaul HaMelech. They just called him Shaul. This played into his fears that he was going to lose his kingdom. And he quotes this following midrash. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Parachia taught, at first, had anyone said to me that I should take on some position of prominence, I would have forced him into a lion's den. But now, should anyone tell me to abdicate my position of prominence, I would pour a kettle of hot water on them. So too for Shaul. At first, he ran from kavod, but once he ascended the throne, he wanted to kill David, lest he take it from him. Look at the difference that we've seen. And I like Eliot's note there, how novel that we have vain leaders. Absolutely, very, very much. I'm trying to stick out of contemporary politics. I get myself burnt whenever I do that. But absolutely. It's fascinating to me. Ein davar hadash tachat hashamesh. There's nothing new under the sun. And how much we learn here that Shaul, what's his issue? When they were in the front lines on the battlefield, there was no jealousy. It's only once they returned to the city, to the court, that's the point where the jealousy comes, where the women, as it were, come and ascribe, who's the flavor of the month today? It's no longer King Saul. Saul's no longer the tall, handsome, young king. It's now the pretender. It's David. And that's where the jealousy begins and the vanity thrown in. And just fascinating, again, that nothing ever changes. We can see all of that. We continue to Pasuk Yud. And there it says, Vahimi machorat, and it was the next day, Vatitzlach ruach Elohim ra'a el Shaul. The evil spirit from Hashem rested on Shaul once again. Vayitnabeh. And normally the word vayitnabeh means he prophesied. but I've translated it there as he raved. He was a little crazy. And you want to see why I translated that way. B'toch habayit, in the house, in the palace. V'David menagen biyado, kayom beyom, and David was playing his harp like he always was. V'hachanit biyad Shaul, and Shaul had a spear in his hand. Now, what's this phrase here, vayitnabe? As I said, it normally means prophesied. Literally, it means prophesied. But Targum Yonatan translates it as ishtate. He became crazed or mad. And he says why? Navi v'shoteh midvarim divrei remazim she'enam nikarim. A prophet and a madman speak with unintelligible hints. It's actually very difficult to discern one from the other. But here, this wasn't prophecy. This was the crazed utterances of a mad person. That, as I said, as Shaul saw that the power was the ruach of being king was being departed from him. This melancholy, this depression, this bipolar nature, perhaps we would describe it as today, was really taking over Shaul. And it says here in Yud Aleph, Vayatel Shaul et hachanit, Vayomer akeh beDavid uvakir, Vayisov David mipanav pamayim. And Shaul cast the spear and said, I shall pin David to the wall. And David turned from before him twice. What's happening here? You have a look at the commentary. The Malbim has a very interesting take on this. As David played, concentrating on his harp and not watching Shaul, the king threw his spear as if he was in target practice. So that if it hit David, it will appear to have been an accident. Hashem caused the unsuspecting David to turn away at that very moment, so that the spear missed him. Not realizing that the weapon had been aimed at him, David continued playing, and Shaul tried again with the same result. Now, imagine, I don't think Shaul and David, they couldn't have been more than 20 feet away from each other, maybe even less. And there's where Yud Bet speaks out. Vayira Shaul milifnei David, ki haya Hashem imo, u'me'im Shaul sar. Shaul feared David. Why? Because God was with him, while he had turned away from Saul. Vaisirehu Shaul me'imo, vaisimehu lo sar aleph, vayetze vayavo lifnei ha'am. So Shaul removed him from being with him and made him for himself a captain over 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And it says there, Yudalad, Vahi David lechol dorachav maskil, v'Adonai imo, very famous pasuk. And David was successful in all his ways, and God was with him. Vayar Shaul, ashehu maskil ma'od, vayagor mipanav. And Shaul saw that he was very successful, and he feared him even more. And then it says, V'chol Yisrael v'Yehuda ohevet David, ki hu yotzeh vava lifnehem. And all Israel and Yehuda loved him, for he went out and came in before them. It seems no matter what Shaul is trying, it's just the growth and growth, the rise and rise of David, and Shaul is cowering and becoming more and more paranoid and afraid and fearful. And it says here, the Malbim says on these verses, Shaul, realizing that David could only have been saved by divine intervention, became even more frightened by David. He hoped that David would be killed in combat, but this too backfired, as all this led to even more adulation for David by the people. And so Shaul's in a bit of a sticky situation here. The more he stays in the palace, the more he drives me crazy. The more he seems to get the adulation of the people. Let's send him out to the battlefield. He's also doing well. Perhaps I need to pull him not on just in general battle, but maybe I need to put him on the front lines. Perhaps that will help. And that doesn't seem to be working. So maybe, I don't know. So he says here in 17, perhaps I have to do another plan. Vayomer Shaul el David, Hinei biti hagedola meirav, ota eten lecha liisha, ach heye li leben chayil, milachem milchamot Hashem, v'Shaul amar, al tehi yadi bo, utehi bo yad pelishtim. Shaul said to David, behold, my elder daughter Meirav, I shall give her to you as a wife, but be a warrior for me and wage the wars of God. For Saul said, let not my hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him. And says there in Yudchet, Vayomer David el Shaul, mi anochi, umi chayai, mishpachat abi b'Yisrael, keyeh chatan lamelech. And David said to Shaul, who am I? And what is my life? O my father's family in Israel, that I should be a son-in-law to the king. What an offer! Why shouldn't I take you up on this? I'm just lowly David. Of course, I'd be very happy to be your son-in-law. Vahi be'et tetet Meirav bat Shaul David, and it was the time that Meirav, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David. Vahi nitna le'Adriel ha'mecholati le'isha, and instead she was given to Adriel, the Mecholatite, as a wife. What's happened? Why has she been given away? I thought he was going to be the wife of David. Why has she been given to Adriel? And Rob brings a beautiful message here. Shaul is exactly like Lavan. Beautiful. Just as Lavan changed the conditions for marrying his daughters, so too it seems that Shaul is changing the deal. Let's have a look at the notes here. In the Art Scroll commentary, it writes, God uses people against themselves in order to carry out his design for the world. Joseph's brothers wanted to condemn him to a life of slavery, but by their hand in selling him into slavery, that made him the viceroy of Egypt. Had they not sold him to Egypt, he never would have got that position. Saul wanted to thrust David into life-threatening situations, but he was responsible for making David even more popular than ever. Now, what about this question, who am I and what is my life? Is David just being humble here, or is there something more? The Mamnoah says this does show David's humility. I'm not worthy of marrying the older daughter of the king. But some commentators explain that Adam Harishon, Adam, contributed 70 years of his life to David so that he may live. David was destined to die at birth, and Adam's generosity saved him. Another midrash says that the Avot gave some of their years to David. David is saying, my whole life I owe to others. I don't deserve all of these honors. Or who am I if not for my father's house? Whether you take it the midrash or you see it's David's humility, he's saying, I'm nothing. Whatever you want, I rely on other people's kindnesses. And what's this thing here that Meirav becomes betrothed to Adriel? Was this a plot of Saul, of Shaul, or was it something else? Rashi says, Keshehigia zman שקבעו לתיתה לו, ובעוד שהיו מתעסקים לתיתה לו, נתגלל הדבר ונתנה לאדריאל. When the time which they had set to give her to him arrived, and while they were yet occupied with giving her to him, the matter turned out that she was given to Adriel. What does that mean? Rashi's a little ambiguous. The Mitzudot David is a little bit clearer. He says, והיא ניתנה על ידי עצמה לאדריאל, וקבלה ממנו קידושין, בלא דעת אביה. She accepted the betrothal to Adriel without her father's knowledge. Wow, she was a feminist. She organized her own marriage without telling her father. What's going on here? This wasn't a conspiracy, as Rob points out. This isn't Lavan who said, you know what, you're going to marry Merav, and then actually, you know what, sorry, Merav's gone, you're going to have to marry someone else. No, this is, Merav, she may have liked David, but she wanted to marry Adriel. So she got her, she arranged it herself. And Shaul, as it were, had egg on his face, and he was stuck with what to do. A very interesting interpretation. And it says here in Pasuk Kaf, V'te'ehav Michal bat Shaul et David. It turned out the younger daughter, Michal, she loved David. V'yagidu leShaul, and Shaul heard about it. V'yishar b'davar beinav, and he was very happy to hear this news. V'yomer Shaul, and Shaul said, Etenena lo utehi lo lemokesh utehi bo yad pelishtim. V'yomer Shaul el David, b'shtayim titchaten bi hayom. And Shaul said, I shall give her to him, and she will be a snare to him, and the hand of the Pelishtim shall be upon him. And Shaul said to David, with two shall you be my son-in-law today. And that's a very strange thing, with two. What does it mean? With my number two? With my second daughter? Just say, with her name. What does it mean, with two? It's a very strange description. And as Rob mentioned, perhaps this is the more sinister side of Shaul, which is the side of Lavan that we saw, as we all well know from Sefer Bereshit. With one of two, says Rashi, says here, B'shtaim titchaten bi, shtei banot yeshli. I have two daughters. B'achat mehen titchaten bi. With one of them, you'll become my son-in-law. Either I'm going to force Meirav to marry you, or you can marry Michal. But one of them is going to marry you. 22, and again, this is the whole thing with Shaul. By rights, David doesn't need to do anything to marry Meirav or to marry Michal, because he'd already been said by beating Goliath, he should have married the king's daughter. But nevertheless, Shaul wants to change the conditions. Vaitzav Shaul et avadav. It seems, by the way, that by this time, David is not happy. He seems to be very disappointed that Meirav was given to Adriel, and it seems that Shaul's words are not enough. So Shaul has to send servants. Vaitzav Shaul et avadav. So Shaul commands his servants, Dabru el David, Balat, speak to David quietly or whispering or secretly, saying, Hinei chafetz becha hamelech v'chol avadav ahevucha v'ata hitchaten b'melech. Behold, the king desires you, and all his servants love you, and now become the king's son-in-law. By Dabru abdei Shaul be'oznei David, and the servants of Shaul spoke these words in the ears of David, Edom ma'ela, these things. Vayomer David, and David said, Hanekala be'enechem hitchaten b'melech v'anochi ish rash v'nikle. Does becoming the king's son-in-law seem to you to be a light thing? For I'm poor and lightly esteemed. Is this the way that Shaul shows love? I don't seem to be highly esteemed. He doesn't really like me. I get the very suspicion that I'm not flavor of the month with him. Vayagidu abdei Shaul lo lemor, kadivrim ha'ele diber David. And Shaul's servants tell Shaul, this is what David said. Kafhei, vayomer Shaul, and Shaul said back, Ko tomru David, so shall you say to David, Ein chefetz lamelech b'mohar, ki b'mea orlot plishtim lehinakem be'oivei hamelech, v'Shaul chashav lehapil et David b'yad plishtim. So shall you say to David, the king has no desire in a dowry, but in 100 foreskins of the Philistines, to avenge himself upon the king's enemies. But Shaul thought to make David fall by the hands of the Philistine. Again, as Rob said, perhaps again, this is Shaul's way of tripping up David, that David should die by the hands of the Philistines. But David doesn't see it that way. David sees this as an opportunity to get glory for Hashem. Vayagidu avadav leDavid, and the servants tell these words to David. David's very happy about this. To marry, to become the son-in-law of the king. And the days hayotnet filled. He was so excited, he wanted to run up and do what he was asked. And see here on 26, the commentary says, the Ralbag, this means that even with this difficult condition, he had such trust in God, so much bitachon, that it was clear to everyone that God was with him, that he delivered not 100, but 200 foreskins within the time limit given to him. This should have been an impossible task. You know, it's not just killed 100 people, it's kill them, mutilate them, bring them back. It should have been impossible. Kav Zayin, Vayakom David, David arose, Vayelechu va'anashav, he went with his men, Vayach va'pelishtim matayimish, he struck 200. Vayaved David et olotehem, and he brought their foreskins, Vaymalum lamelech, and he delivered them to the king, Lehitchaten b'melech, to marry, to be the son-in-law of the king, Vayten lo Shaul et Michal bito leisha, and Shaul had to give him his daughter Michal as a wife. And then it says 28, Vayar Shaul, and Shaul saw, Vayeda, and he knew, Ki Hashem im David, he saw that God was with David, Umichal bat Shaul ahevatu. And now not only did Yonatan, his son, love him, but also Michal, his daughter, loved him. And we'll finish off the parak here. Vayosef Shaul lero mipnei David od, vahi Shaul oyev et David kol hayamim. And Shaul grew still more afraid of David, and Saul was hostile to David. He was oyev, an enemy, or a trapper, who he sat and wait all the days, you know, too much. Really hated him. Vayetzu Sari Pelishtim, and the princes of the Philistines went out. Vahi midei Tzeitam Sachal David Mikol Avdei Shaul Vayikar Shemo Me'od. As they came out, that David was more successful than all Saul's servants, and his name was highly esteemed. He was very precious. What's all going on here? See the last of the commentaries here. The Radak, Rav David Kimchi of Provence, says, Lefiha Hosif Lira Mipanav, Lishnei Devarim, Achad Shera'a Ki Hashem Imo, V'od Shemicha Bito Ahevato. Shaul feared David even more because he saw that God was with him, and also that his daughter Michal loved him. And what does it mean that he was highly esteemed? Says the Radak, there was a midrash that states that he was esteemed through Jewish law. Not just everyone liked him. What happened? That since the Philistine heard that David had just wed, they assumed he would not be fighting. Why? Because everyone knows a new bridegroom, he takes the year off. Yeah, that's what it says in the Torah. You have a year off for your first year of marriage. However, this is only for Milchemet Reshut, for a voluntary war. But a rule which is a Milchemet Mitzvah, which is settling the borders of Eretz Israel, even a bridegroom is obligated, as it says here, Afilu Chatan Mechadro V'Kala Mechupata. You take him even from his bridal chamber and even from the canopy of the chuppah. So here we see that he beat them in halachic knowledge, and therefore, when they were expected him to have his, to be focusing on his new wife, he was still planning, and they thought, oh, now's our chance to go and get David, and he's like, no, now it's my chance to surprise you, and he beat them even more. So as I said, this chapter, chapter 18, it's the rise and rise of David. Everyone loves him. Hashem is with him. Yonatan loves him. Michal loves him. The people love him. The women are in adulation of him. And the pure wrath is just more and more and more jealousy comes out of Shaul. The jealousy is just too hard to bear for him. That's all I have. Any questions?